Okay, well then I will get us started. It's a little after 6 here, and my name is John Joseph, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to STR's Meet the Scholar program. For those that have not participated in one of these before, they were started last year, and it was an attempt to get our community together to help folks get to know scholars in the field through a candid conversation. Obviously, we couldn't meet in person. There was a desire to create this sense of community. We had great success. I want to say there was 24. Tim, I might have that number off, but it's something in that neighborhood. There were quite a few, and they were all well attended, and it was such a great hit that the leadership of STR wanted to keep the ball rolling and continue them this year. And this is one of those. I've been lucky enough to moderate a few others, and this one obviously holds a special place of excitement for me here. I'm going to share my screen and bring up this slide here. Okay, you can see this slide. Is that good? Okay. Well, and I guess before I get started, just a few, I think, sort of ground rules. I think we'll encourage folks to keep your microphone on mute. We'll try to shoot for about 45 minutes where I'll sort of, talk with Vibha and get her thoughts on a variety of subjects. Folks are absolutely welcome to put questions in the chat or save them until we're finished, and we'll make sure that we have plenty of time for folks to ask her whatever is on your mind. So with that, I will introduce our scholar, who is for me a co-author, a friend, and someone really to look up to in this field, Vibha Gaba, who's at INSEAD. And just a little bit about her. She is professor of entrepreneurship at INSEAD, so she got full last year, I think. And her PhD's from the Lundquist College of Business at the University of Oregon. She studies a variety of topics, including diffusion processes, behavioral models of adaptation, performance feedback, aspirations, multiple goals and structure. She also does work on corporate entrepreneurship and venture capital. She has an international presence. She's obviously very active at SMS in the leadership there, as well as OMT at the Academy. You look at her vita, she's got numerous awards and recognitions. She's a star teacher across programs and has a variety of honors from the Academy of Management. And most recently, she has taken one of the new editor roles at Strategic Management Journal. So I'm sure we're all anxious to hear about that and what she's thinking about the field of strategy. So welcome, Vibha, to our Meet the Scholar.
Thank you, John, for a very generous introduction. Yeah.
So let's, I have some, pre-prepared questions. Maybe we'll get to all of them or not. But, I think one of the things that folks are often interested in is kind of how you got into academia. How did you get to choose this career path and ended up at Oregon and then eventually INSEAD?
Yeah. Okay, first of all, I really actually want to acknowledge the STR division for doing this wonderful initiative and for, of course, inviting me as well. Tim, Jao, Asim and Samina, they're doing great, things for the STR division. And I have been involved with some of the initiatives last year as well. So it's really nice. So thank you for doing this. It's lovely. John, to your question, I realized being in academia for so long that how good we get or become at telling stories and rationalizing, things. And I guess I could rationalize that it was all sort of thought out, and I would enter into academia, get into a PhD, go get a job in a business school, so forth. But it wasn't really like this, right? So I think I knew what I didn't want to do rather than what I wanted to do, to be honest. And two things were very salient in my mind when I was in college. One thing was that I had a complete and utter sort of lack of interest in finding a job after graduating. I didn't want to work in the corporate world, and I showed no interest of doing that. Um, and um, and I and one thing I knew is that I didn't want to be told what to do. I wanted to do what I wanted to do. And I thought, staying in school was a wonderful way to achieve both these things. So that's part of the, I think background story of how I sort of got into academia. Um, I think the second thing is the family context. My mom was a teacher, my grandfather was a teacher. My parents really, appreciated, education. They wanted their kids to educate themselves as much as they wanted to. They never put pressure on us, but they always encouraged that, do what you want to do, study what you like to do, and so forth. And my mom was really, really supportive of trying things. So she would always encourage me to try things and be adventurous. So I think that was it. I mean, I was also in a graduate school where I saw a lot of my cohorts, applying for PhD program in the US, and I said, well, that seems like a interesting option. And so I think I stumbled into it rather than it was very planned and well thought out kind of path for me. But the interesting thing is that I did my master's in sociology. So, and this was in Delhi School of Economics in India. And business schools were not, known in that environment. I mean, I knew sociologists, anthropologists, but not business school people. And this is not what I saw people around me applying for a PhD. Many of them did PhD in sociology, but not in business school. Um, this was something that I discovered I wanted to do because as a stop just to entertain myself, I became a journalist for about a year and a half and worked for a financial daily in India. And my job there was to really write stories about a lot of multinational firms that were entering into India and try to understand their entry strategies in emerging markets, and especially in India. So I would go and interview all these managers working for these MNCs and ask them, how did they decide to enter into India? What was their plan? And I really enjoyed those conversations. And I found what they were doing very fascinating. And that's how, I started thinking about organizations, how they work, how they operate, uh, you know, how they make decisions. And that was one of the, I think, experience that led me to explore business schools as a possible way to do a PhD, and especially in org theory and management.
So it clearly, got you interested in organizations and decision making. How did you end up with the dissertation topic, diffusion processes? How did you kind of get latched onto that first? I know I mentioned you got a lot of research interest, and we certainly want to talk about that. But what about the early stuff?
Yeah, so I think I wasn't really sort of I wasn't really focused on diffusion per se as a topic when I was, exploring topics for my dissertation. But I had, these chance encounters. One of the ex-PhD students of Alan used to work, had graduated from the PhD program, decided didn't want to go into academia, and decided to go and work for Intel Capital. And he came for a lunch with Alan, and Alan invited me. So I was just sitting and having a conversation with him where he was explaining his job to me. And that time, it was very new, and he was explaining what Intel was trying to do. They were setting up these corporate venture capital. It was a corporate venture capital unit. Their mandate was to go and invest in these startup companies. And to nurture them and try to figure out if there were any sort of strategic sort of complementarities between what the startup was doing as well as Intel Capital. And so he was explaining his job. It sounded super interesting. I'd never heard about this. So I went and I started reading about it, and that time, this was in many years ago, in 2000, when there was a lot of excitement and a dot-com boom happening, and to be followed by a bust very soon. So I got super interested in his role, in his job, and it was, in the same spirit. I was talking to these managers, people trying to understand what they do and get interested just in the ideas, uh, in their jobs and their challenges in one sense. So I got interested. Then I realized there was a big industry conference on this particular topic, which was happening in Monterey, California, very soon. And I asked Alan if I could go and attend that conference. And I did. And that was, where there were about 200 odd people representing a lot of companies, a lot of high profile companies, like especially in the IT sector, Sun Microsystems, Adobe, IBM, all these big companies. And there were people from there. And I just, was completely and utterly fascinated by the phenomena, right? And then it's a part of coming back to your office, your basement office as a PhD student, and figuring out how do you study this, right? What kind of theories do you really adopt, what questions you ask, that would help you understand and also explain this to a wider academic community. And I think that was how the sheer interest and excitement around corporate venture capital practices, and the diffusion of it was something that led me to think of it as a diffusion process. And so I studied the adoption of these programs among the IT population, IT firms. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned a couple people, the PhD student, and obviously Alan. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, in this context of sort of finding a dissertation and getting it done, who were the important people that, shaped you as a young burgeoning scholar?
I think definitely Alan. He was a huge sort of an early influence in thinking, and there's certain things that I really appreciated about Alan. I think Alan is a qualitative researcher, and I thought I was going to do a dissertation which was entirely qualitative, and I would go to the field, I would collect data and write a dissertation based on that qualitative data. I didn't quite end up doing that, but what I learned from Alan and really appreciated was going into the field and just talking to the people that you want to actually study, right? And how did I benefit from it? I think it helped me ask more interesting questions about the phenomena. It helped me conceptualize my research better, I think. It helped me theorize my research better. So I think, this is something I really learned from Alan, that even if you don't want to do qualitative work, I think it's really absolutely important for us to go to the field and just interact with the organizations if you can, or the people, and try to understand the world from their perspective. I think it makes you a better researcher. So I think that I think I still do, if I can, very often in any new project that I am working on. So I think Alan, big influence of Alan, and I think I also through his network met a series of scholars in our field who were just extremely generous with their time and would talk to you and you know and in little ways kind of influence your thinking and your development as a scholar, and there's so many of them. Yeah.
It sounds like Alan was also willing to give you some advisors have a heavier hand than others, but he was willing to let you take this and go in a more, quantitative
Yeah,
direction.
yeah. Yeah, no, I think if I know Alan well, I think his approach really is to be a supportive advisor. He wants to encourage you to do what you find interesting, and he wants you to do it the way you find interesting and study it the way you want to study it. So I think, yeah, I thought he was an extremely supportive advisor. That's it.
So obviously people matter a lot in our careers. I'm wondering, was there an early paper, series of papers, area of study, something that, contributed to your thinking?
And I think, John, you know the answer to that, right?
So is that a loaded question?
Yeah, yeah. I think my favorite book is, of course, all-time favorite book that I read in our field is the behavioral theory of the firm, the organizations, administrative behavior, all the work by Jim March and Herb Simon, Dick Stead. I think these Carnegie School books were quite interesting, useful, in my thinking and in my development as a scholar. So and very enjoyable. I mean, I am completely and utterly fascinated how Jim March and Dick Stead, sitting in their office in the universities, could sort of capture so well the complexity of how organizations work. They, I think, really capture the complexity of it really, really well, and I enjoyed that.
Well, and your work has obviously a lot of it is in behavioral theory of the firm, but different aspects of it. How do you? We have a lot of junior folks participating, a lot of PhD students thinking about what to pursue. How do you decide on, now beyond your dissertation topic, how do you decide what to study? How do you decide on your research questions? Do you look for similar inspiration in the setting, or what sort of motivates you now?
I think I think the way I like to ask interesting questions. I don't worry about theories, at least initially. I want to ask an interesting question. I want to ask something that puzzles me, and I want to know the answer to it. And so a lot of, when I'm thinking about initial projects, I don't read our papers, I don't read our theories. I read newspapers. A lot. I read magazines, and because it's an observation. It helps me see the world, the organizational world that I actually want to study, and the decision making processes. So it gives me insights on what's interesting, what's going on there. So I read a lot of news stories, and then, if I get interested in something, I dig deeper, and it's only after I have a clearer sense of what's an interesting question that I want to ask, I go back to our literature and try to see if we already know the answer, which is fine. At least my puzzle has been solved relatively painlessly. If not, then I try to develop it further into a more sort of a coherent research project. But what it also, so that's but but after you start working in a particular domain and you know the literature well, you also know what are some of the things that we don't know. And so it's easier to identify what, gaps in the literature and ask questions around it. So I think for me, the most always the most important thing is to ask an interesting question, rather than worry about, what domain, what topic, and so forth.
Well, this will sound like a loaded question too, but co-authors. Obviously, you've had many, but a lot of folks that are starting out trying to decide how to find co-authors, whether they should find co-authors, should they find seniors, should they find juniors? Could you maybe provide a little insight there as to how you approach that?
Yeah. And Asim has immediately a question which has popped off on my computer, on my screen, saying, "How did you end up working with a loser like John?" And Asim, I was just gonna say that my selection criteria for co-authors is to have people whose first name and last name starts with the same letter, right? John Joseph. No, um, I think I think. I think it's really important when I'm looking for co-authors to really be able to connect with them. You just don't, you talk to people and you get this intuitive sense whether you enjoy, you would enjoy meeting this person more often, talking to them. And I think I need to get that sense. Because I realize it is really important. When you work with your co-authors, you spend a lot of time with them and you work sometimes under a lot of pressure, deadlines, and sometimes your projects sort of don't evolve in a way you anticipate, so there are setbacks and so forth, and it's a very stressful time sometimes. So you want to be with a person you can connect with, you can understand with. So I have been actually very, very lucky to have really wonderful co-authors who became very good and close friends of mine also, eventually. But I think it's very important for me to be able to connect with a person, be comfortable with them, and then work with them. I think that's really important. I think as a junior scholar, one thing that I realize is that you want to find co-authors that have the same sense of urgency about doing research that you have, about publishing and so forth, right? That's really important, because sometimes what happens is when junior scholars sort of collaborate with senior professors, they learn a lot. They learn the craft of writing and presenting their research, taking it through the review process, so you learn a lot. But senior scholars are also very busy. And for them, the sense of urgency is sometimes missing, right? So if the paper is 1 month late, 2 months late, they're not going to lose sleep over it. But for junior scholars, it can be very consequential. So I think it's important to find people, especially early on in their career, who also, are as driven and as motivated as you are, to bring the projects to closure. I think that's really important considerations, especially for the junior scholars. Working with your cohorts, you teach each other a lot. I think with John and I, we taught each other quite a bit. We learned from each other quite a bit, and it's also really fun working with cohorts, in my experience.
I do remember you saying at one point that it was during the revision of a particular paper, and you said something to the effect of, "You were talking to me more than your husband."
Exactly. So when I know, and I think this has happened to us quite a bit. When you're revising paper, you speak so much to your co-authors so frequently that you land up chatting to them more than your partners, and it's very funny. So I knew exactly when John was sleeping, why he was getting angry, with whom he was getting angry, what did he eat for dinner. I knew everything, and I think the same for him as well. So yeah, so it's a very intensive collaboration. So I think it's important to be with people. The other thing I realize, over time is, if you want to spend more time with people in academia, you need to do research projects with them, right? Because that's a wonderful way to spend a lot of time with people you like, you admire, you appreciate, and want to connect with. So yeah, I think that's important.
So you mentioned the role of talking to managers, the fact that so much of your work is informed by getting out there in the field. Even if it's not a qualitative study, there's an element of understanding that comes from that. And I'm wondering, maybe shifting a little bit to teaching, how how your research and your teaching interface, and maybe more generally how you approach your teaching and incorporating some of the research that you do, if you do that.
Yeah. Um, you know, um, it's so at INSEAD, executive education is a big part of our core portfolio, teaching portfolio. It's a very prominent part as well. So invariably, everyone who works at INSEAD at some point sort of transitions to teaching executives. I did this transition relatively early in my career. So I started with the MBAs and PhD. We don't have an undergrad program. Um, but then I very quickly transitioned to teaching executives. And part of the reason was what I wanted to teach, which was essentially topics related to organizational change. I thought that people with more experienced people could relate better to the complexity of change and how to orchestrate change in organizations, which is a big challenge. Um, so so I when I was making these transitions, everyone would sort of make you anxious about teaching executives. Oh, these are such experienced people. They have years of experience. They are, how can you teach them? You've never worked in an organization. You look young, and so forth. So, I was anxious because I felt I looked young. I was a female. I was going and talking to these people who were in, important positions in big organizations, and I had never worked in one effectively in a corporate world. Um, so I actually decided I was not going to be defensive about this at all. So I went there and I stood and I said, "Hey, I'm an academic. I know theory of change and I want to talk to you about it. You tell me whether it works in practice or not, and we'll have a conversation about it." So, and I think, it worked really well for me, because what I realized was a lot of these executives, when they come to a business school to do a course, whether it is a short-term course or a course spread over weeks and months, um, they don't want to. They want to hear what we have to tell them, right? And I think and this was a very nice and a pleasant experience for me. So I felt really comfortable going there and saying, "This is what we know in theory. Do you think this works in your world? If not, why does it not work?" And so that was one thing. So I was not going to be defensive about where I'm coming from, what I'm bringing to the conversation, because I think it's important. I realize. The second thing is, I structured my class in a way that I could help these people think about their experiences and learn from their experiences, as well from others. So my classes are extremely interactive, where I try to avoid lecturing, and these guys have little patience for lectures anyway. But I want to create an environment where people can have conversations, they can learn abstract ideas, the frameworks that we bring for them. but also share their experience and reflect on their experience and learn from them, right? Um, and I have no sort of, problems pushing them about superstitious learning, right? So some people learn from their experience in different ways. So I push them and saying, what do you learn from from this experience? What does it tell you? How would you do some things differently? So it is about bringing more rigor into their thinking processes. I think that's what I try to accomplish in my class, but in a very structured way. Um, and I think it's worked for me. So I have been teaching actually mainly executives for almost a decade now at INSEAD. That's much of my onload teaching. Yeah.
Just a little bit on the teaching thing. I think, young scholars, rookies, I guess in particular, often are daunted by the teaching task.
Mm.
And INSEAD teaching is notoriously, tough. And I'm wondering, maybe advice, something that, some things that maybe you've experienced that have helped you, that have smoothed your, and made you successful and helped you win these, teaching recognitions.
Yeah. So I think one of the rookie mistakes we all do is that we focus too much on the content, right? So when we are doing our teaching prep, we spend an enormous amount of time uh, working on the content and squeezing as much content as we can in a very short period of time. I think that's a security blanket, to be honest, right? The more sort of papers we can talk of, the more frameworks we can talk of, the more things we can talk of, we feel, that would be better. It doesn't work because I think in teaching, it's not just the content which matters, it's the delivery that matters as well. So I think it's really important when you're approaching your teaching um, to also focus or give enough attention to how you're going to communicate the ideas, right? It's not just having ideas, it's about communicating ideas. That's what teaching is a lot about. That's one thing. The other thing I think is to be uh, again, we are academics, we think in complex ways, and we want to, um, you know, convey the complexity of the idea in their most fullest and comprehensive form. I think it's important to be very clear for every session that you teach. What are the 2 points you will make, right? What are the 2 most important points that you want to convey to the audience or to your students? That's important to have that clarity in your mind, because then you can really have nice conversations because you know where you want to get to, right? And then once you know where you want to get to, I think with experience, you find wonderful ways to get there through conversations. And that's what that was my uh, learning from my experience, right? So not to cram too much content, but also worry about how you're going to communicate or deliver that content. And do it in a, and not sort of, and have clarity on what are the key messages. That's, I think, the most important thing to think about.
Sorry about that. Okay, so a little bit about, so, education, certainly the MBA audience, the executive education audience. Sorry. One of the things that comes up a lot for mid-career folks is that you're beginning to work a lot more with PhD students.
Yeah.
Wondering there, maybe some of your insights in how you approach working with students, selecting them, guiding them. What advice, what experience have you had there?
Yeah. I think I think one of the most important sort of advice I would give to the PhD student is that work on something that you truly like or interested in or curious about. Um, and the reason is because you're going to live with it for a long time. So you better choose a topic, a question that really excites you. Otherwise, it's painful. It's really painful. So, for example, the dissertation topic that you will choose in the PhD program, it's not that you'll forget all about it once you graduate. You will continue to think and work on that topic, years after you graduate. So you spend a significant amount of your life and time on a particular research project. So it's really important. I mean, I cannot emphasize more the importance of working on something that really interests you, that you're curious about. So it's not about it's about solving puzzles, it's about answering questions. So you have to be super interested. So that's one thing, right? So I sort of try to assess, is this particular student really interested in the topic that they're proposing for their research? Are they really fascinated by it? Are they intrigued by it? Or are they just, picking something in a very, because someone asked them to study that, or they think it would be easier to publish that particular topic. So that's one of the key criteria I sort of use. I think what is also um, important for the PhD student is how um, you know if they are sort of willing to take initiatives, right? And would go there and do whatever they need to do in order to find interesting data for a question they're asking, or find ways and means to get feedback on something that they really need feedback. So somebody who's really willing and would take initiatives and won't require constant hand holding, because that makes it hard, right? For the PhD student, and I think also for the advisors as well. So I think self-driven individuals are actually, and PhD students are more fun to work with for me.
Kind of a related question that it comes to mind now that you're talking about this, but often we are faced with PhD students who are struggling, who need help. I think in this COVID time, that might be even especially true. They're remote,
Yeah,
whatever. Um, for any PhD students from Irvine that are online, I'm not talking about you, but you know,
yeah,
any advice there? Again, given the sort of the situation we're all in right now.
yeah. So one of my most pleasant surprises about our profession has been that there's so many people who are so generous with their time, and genuinely care about ideas, right? And I think if our PhD students, no matter where they are, send an email to a scholar, related to who does work on the topic that they're working on, and ask them for a meeting, I would be very surprised that if people don't respond, right? Many of the people we would be happy to have a conversation with you over Zoom, and talk about it. They would be willing to read your paper, give you feedback. So I think it's again about, PhD students being proactive and taking initiatives and seeking what they need, in terms of overcoming the challenges that they face, especially due to the lockdown and the COVID and the isolation, right? So that's what I've been trying to tell the PhD students at INSEAD. You should never feel alone or lonely. You should just, make the best of the situation, right? So go and, send an email to somebody you want to talk to, or send your paper to somebody, ask them for the feedback, and you'd be surprised how receptive people would be to this, right? So I think being proactive, I think, can help. But I think our association, what STR division is doing, for example, creating, coffee and conversations among PhD students and scholars. Last year, Asim was doing that a lot, Samina. I think that was a wonderful initiative. So I met a lot of very nice PhD students. Over Zoom. I didn't know them, they didn't know me, but we had good conversations, and it was really fun.
I think that's very helpful, Vibha. Thank you. So obviously you have recently become an editor for a strategic management journal. Congratulations on that. We still have not celebrated with a drink, but we will. So this, as someone in this position, and I'm sure we all want to know, what do you see for the field, both in terms of opportunities and maybe challenges going forward? And, from your perspective, particularly being new, because you're sort of coming into this now. I mean, you've published it, but now sort of, coming in as a new editor.
So so SMJ is not new to me, right? Because I've been working in my AE role for almost 6 years at the journal now, and I've gotten to know the journal and the people associated with the journal quite well. And my appreciation for the journal obviously has increased a lot. SMJ is an incredibly open-minded journal. That's what I think it is, and I really like that attribute about SMJ, that it is a very open-minded journal. It has become a very open-minded journal, if you disagree with that. And I think the editors, anyone who is associated with the editing role at SMJ is really welcomes any topics related to strategic management, of course, or links to strategic management. But they also care about well-executed research, right? And I think that's important, right? So the rigor matters, and I think so that's I don't know if I'm answering your question well. So it is SMJ is a broad journal. It interests a lot of topics are of interest to the journal.
Maybe trends that you've seen, both as an AE and now, of course, in your current role?
Yeah. So I think one trend that is clearer to me than the others that I've observed in the last few years is the methodological bar is going up in our journals. I think this is true for all journals, not just SMJ. So we care about the well-executed research. That's important. And I think that's one of the most common reason papers get rejected in SMJ, and I think in other journals as well. There's always, a gap between the conceptual ideas and how those conceptual ideas are executed, right? So that gap is one of the most sort of common reason for rejection of papers at the journal. So I think I think, and we've learned about new methods. There's an infusion of new methodological tools in our field. Better ways to sort of, make causal claims, for example, to, other methods to analyze big data, topic modeling, machine learning methods. I think I see a clear trend that more and more work that we will see being submitted to the journal will not only have big data, but also more new methodologies which allow us to capture um, capture uh, interesting sort of um, attributes about organizations and their organizing behavior more in very general terms.
Well, now we'll I'm sure you're going to get more of these types of questions as we go forward here. I'm going to switch gears. First thing, I think there is a request to have a group photo while we're sort of in the middle here. So Zhao, I guess you're going to do a group shot.
Yes, if everyone who's dressed, as Amina used to say, who's dressed from waist up, if you could turn on your video and we would just take a screenshot. All right. 1, 2, 3, say cheese. Okay, we got it. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to channel Samina at the end with a few of the crazy questions she, not crazy, but interesting questions that she has, but I'll save those for the end and right now turn to some of the questions that have come up in the chat and then open it up also to folks who are with us. The first question is Tim actually put in a question. Tim, would you like to share that question?
Yeah, sure. I just, I told you before we started that I just participated in the STR paper development workshop, and we had people like Jackson Nickerson and Brian Silverman and Xavier Castaner. And we asked them to give tips to these young scholars. And I'm catching you on the spot here, but you've given us some tips already, but I just wanted to know if you had any others that were at the, at the ready.
I think Tim, I would repeat, I would reiterate some of the things I said earlier, and I think it's also partly because I see they benefited me in my, myself as a PhD scholar. Is about finding really topics and questions that interest you, because that's important. I think we underestimate the importance of that. You have to always ask yourself, why is this interesting, what you're studying? Why is this interesting to yourself? Because ultimately you also have to convey that to the readers of your research, right? So I think it's important to ask that question early and ask it genuinely in one sense, right? Is it really interesting? Definitely. I think the second important sort of tip I would say is to be proactive. People are nice in our field, or at least I'm the privileged one to have really met a lot of nice people. So I have this impression that we have lots of nice folks in our community who are very generous, very helpful. So seek help when you need to, and be proactive about it. I think what you don't want to do as a young scholar or as a PhD student and just sit by yourself in the PhD in your office. I think that's not going to get you anywhere. So that's important to, I think all of you know, but it's worth sort of highlighting again that research is actually a very, very social activity, right? Lots of ideas, development of the ideas come as you interact with people. So that's an important element we shouldn't forget. I mean, there's a part of it when you want to be alone in your office when you're writing, actually, but in the initial stages, when you're thinking about ideas, when you're conceptualizing them, it's a very social activity. The more you meet people, the better you get at it. So I think see research as social, not just as a very individual kind of endeavor. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so our next question, Abhi, would you like to ask your question about fad topics?
Sure. Hi, Professor Gaba. It's such an honor to hear you speak, especially the backstory of your illustrious journey thus far. I was wondering, since you and many of us also draw so much inspiration from the news and current affairs and media reporting, do you have any tips on avoiding pitfalls when it comes to picking up something that seems really interesting in this time and in the moment, but might really be just a fad?
You know, we study fads as well, so you can study it as a fad, right? We've studied fads and fashion in management research as well. So I think you know, maybe I sort of miscommunicated and made it seem like a very linear process. It is not, right? So the bigger point is, you know, at least I like to inform my research through qualitative observations of the business world and what they're doing. But then you go back to your office, you try to study, you understand the literature and you know, anything that might inform your observations, then you go back. So it's you know, you keep going back and forth in terms of it's a iterative process, right? Where you observe something interesting, but then you come back to your scholarship, your you know, papers and literature around or related to that. You try to understand it from an academic point of view, then you go back to the world. So it's back and forth. And I think that keeps you, in one sense, focused, right? On finding something interesting, right? If some behavior is fad, I think that's interesting in itself, right? Why is it a fad? Why is it becoming a fad? You know, is it really truly something that organizations are doing, or is it it is just some rhetoric that they have, right? Decoupling, a very important topic in org theory, right? Where we know that organizations do this all the time. You know, there's decoupling of activities which are done for stakeholder management versus, you know, which really affect the operations of the firm. So you can think about it in different ways. I don't know if that answers your question, sort of.
It also goes back to your point, Vibha, something you mentioned very early on is you start with the interesting question.
Yeah, exactly.
Which seems to be guiding theme. Okay, Jasmine has a question. Would you like to?
Oh, yes, sir,
Okay.
definitely. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Gaba, for all of your advice. And I really think your background's so interesting, how you're coming from a blend of the humanities and business. So I really relate to that. I guess for my question is for new PhD students and new graduate students in general, discipline is extremely important. And I believe that you have a lot of it to be where you're at. So I was wondering how your discipline evolved from the beginning of your graduate journey to the end, like a summary of that. And if you could look back and give your past self any advice on that, what would you give yourself?
Yeah. You know, I have broad interests. I guess it's partly because of, you know, the background I have. I did my bachelor's in economics. So then I did my master's in sociology. And then I decided to do a PhD, which was focused more on organization theory and management. I think, you know, I think you're coming from from different disciplinary backgrounds, the advantage, of course, is that it helps you see things in different ways, right? So you can relate to different perspectives. I think that's one of the advantages. I see it as a strength, right? So it makes you a little bit broad-minded in terms of how you think about a problem and how you address it. But sometimes it also makes it harder, right? In the sense that what you realize is with the PhD, you are actually aiming to become a deep expert in a very narrow domain, right? So we sort of appreciate expertise, deep expertise, but in a narrow domain. That's what the PhD program in some way prepares you for it. It focuses you, it narrows you, it specializes you, right? Even within a field. But I think irrespective of that, if you have different and disciplinary background, I think it just informs your thinking in it informs your thinking, you know, in some ways. I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Hanson, you're next.
Great, thanks. Hi, Professor Vibha. Thanks for being with us today, and I wish you have a wonderful holiday break. So my question is this: as a scholar, the scientific career could be extremely challenging sometimes. And could you share with us what is the most challenging time in your career so far, and how did you manage it? Thank you very much.
Yeah. I think it's very funny, right? So when you join the PhD program, you think, if only I would get through my comprehensive exams, life would be easier. You clear your comprehensive exams, and then you realize it actually gets harder. Then you feel, you know, if I finish my dissertation, if I just get it done, then I would be, you know, okay. Life will get easier. It doesn't, right? Because then you have to find a job. You find a job, and, you know, now you can buy a nice mattress, which was my actually dream after I graduated, that I'm going to get a really nice mattress to sleep on. I didn't have one nice one as a graduate student. So you can, and then you realize, you know, you have a job and you have essentially been trained for half of that job, right? Because you are trained to be a researcher, but we don't get trained so well to be a teacher. And suddenly you become an assistant professor and you're teaching and you have to go into the classroom. So you are again sort of scrambling a little bit. And then you think, you know, so your life is not getting easier. Then of course you say, after tenure, it'll get easier. It'll get easier. And it does, actually, it does. So it's a very convoluted way to tell that I think the most challenging part of our, you know, our careers are very front-loaded. I don't know if it is good or bad, but it is really front-loaded. So the first few years when you become an assistant professor are, I think, one of the hardest in our career. And that's what I found the most you know, challenging years of my life as well. And it's not just because of, you know, the professional demands. It's also about balancing, you know, personal and professional lives, right? So at least for many of us, and especially for women, the early part of our assistant professor career coincides with, you know, the time when we think about having children, you know, we have families. So it's a balancing all that, I think, was very, very hard. And that was the time I wasn't quite sure, you know, that I would make it, because, you know, being in a new job, assistant professor, learning how to teach, you know, trying to publish your research. I wanted to have kids, you know, I had little kids. You know, I had some medical issues with my back, which made me go on leave for a couple of months. It all just sort of was coming together and making it extremely hard and challenging. on an everyday basis, I think.
Thank you for that question. Jiang Chen, you're next.
So, hi, Professor. Thanks for your stories. So my question is, because you have the experience crossing the organizational behavior, organizational theory and strategy. So my question is, would you share with us some of your experience when you do the research in both areas? And also, what are the boundaries and what are the challenges you think we should take care of? Thank you.
Yeah. I think the way I have, I mean, so I can think about, the one way I can think about myself is, I'm an org theorist with very keen interest in strategic management issues, or the issues that concern strategic issues that concern organizations, right? So again, it's about a question that I can ask, which could be related to organizational decision making, but my org theory background in some way provides me the theoretical toolkit through which I can study those questions. And that's a very natural sort of, complementarity I see between what you say as an org theory domain and a strategic management domain, right? So the org theory domain, it gives me the toolkit I need to study lots of these interesting questions relevant for strategic management of the organizations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can, you're up.
Yes, hello everybody from Milan, Italy, and it's almost 4 a.m. right now in here. And a very big thank you to the STR division and also Vibha for coming. So my question will be a bit more specific to the behavioral theory of the firm. And you have actually done lots of work around the BTOF, including some papers with John. So first of all, how do you see behavioral theory developing, and where is it going? And maybe even more specifically, you know that like this theory has analyzed different firm behaviors such as innovation, M&As, our organizational change in connection to performance feedback. So what other firm behaviors can we explore, again, with regard to different types of performance feedback?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you for waking up at 4 a.m. I appreciate you being here. I'll have to give you a very biased opinion here because, this is in sort of my thinking. One thing you realize is that the behavioral theory of the firm is very internally focused theory, right? So it talks about organizational processes, it captures the complexity of it in a nice way, but it is very internally focused, right? But we know that organizations sort of exist in a broader environment. And I think that would be an interesting extensions of the behavioral theory when you start taking considerations of how the environment around the organization is actually changing, and how is that sort of impacting how they manage their internal processes and also their decision making, right? And one of the most interesting thing, at least, maybe this is more salient now, given the COVID shock, when you have discontinuities in your environment, right? And how do you manage these discontinuities? How do you think about these discontinuities? How are these organizations actually thinking about the COVID shock? How is it impacting their internal processes? How are they changing them as a consequence of that? Can sort of, what we know from the behavioral theory, how can we sort of study it, but also consider what's happening in the external environment in a more sort of systematic way. So I think that's something worth exploring going forward. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll remind folks, I'll ask now, if folks have questions, feel free to jump in. You can also put your question in the chat. While we're waiting for those, Vibha, maybe a question about what you're working on now. What sort of research projects do you have going on?
So, so I, so a couple of interesting projects. And I am going back and looking at diffusion processes again, once more. It's been a while since I worked on diffusion as a topic, and one of my recent work is actually about diffusions of problems and solutions, right? So when we look at the diffusion literature, a lot of times it is adoption of certain practices. These practices are solutions to some problems, right? That organizations adopt, and there is. But what I am trying to sort of understand is that, what is the problem that is linked to these solutions that diffuse across organizations, and how can we study not just the diffusion of the solutions, but also the problems or the recognition of the problems. It's a very early stage thinking. We are, working with some co-authors and thinking about it. So diffusion of problems and solutions, that's one sort of current project I'm working on. I think I'm also interested a lot in understanding, there's another one which is looking at how discontinuities, how experiences of managers, prior experiences with shocks and crises actually inform their decision making with the most recent one. So that's another one that I am looking at. Yeah. And I think multiple goals and the goal activation problem. How do goals get activated in organizations? At what point in time, which goal becomes salient? I think this is some of the other sort of conceptual ideas I'm thinking about. I don't have a project. I'm waiting, John, for you to respond on to talk to me about it. But I think I'm at least going to continue thinking about multiple goals and the trade-offs among multiple goals and its impact on decision making in the near future, I guess.
We have a question from Nisha. I don't know if he's there.
Hello, Vibha. My question is that often PhD grads are only able to obtain R&Rs. So we do our best, we try our best to progress the literature and the theory. However, there is a possibility that the submissions remain with the editors and reviewers by the time we graduate. So what advice would you offer to students to improve their job prospects, for example, at INSEAD?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I actually feel for the PhD students. I think, at least when I was in the job market, having a published paper was an exception rather than a norm, but I see it's completely changed in the last decade or more, right? So you see PhD students who are going in the job market, the expectation is at least they will have one published papers or some R&Rs and, a research pipeline, which is already in the review process, right? So there's an enormous pressure on the PhD students to start publishing while they're in the program and have something to show for. I find this a little bit of a worrying trend. I mean, I know this is a trend, but the worry I have here is that the PhD students are not sort of, doing their dissertation or thinking about interesting questions or writing a wonderful dissertation, but worrying more about publishing a paper, right? In whatever way. That's a little sort of, unintended or not so nice outcome I see of this trend, right? So at least at INSEAD, when we are doing, job market invites, of course, if you have a published paper, it matters, but we look at what is your dissertation. Is it interesting? If we try to assess whether it get published or not, right? So I think we want to think about you as a scholar, not just as a PhD student coming out with one A publication. Right? I think, so I think it's really important to, your dissertation is your special project, and put all your attention on writing a nice dissertation. That's one thing. Now, if what I also realize is if, our journals have actually become really good, they have quick turnaround times in most of the, many of all of your review papers, and you can see, the journals give you 4 weeks or 6 weeks to turn around the review. So we are really shortening the review cycles in all the journals. And as an AE, when I was working at SMJ, I always had this 90-day deadline. We had to, more than 95% of the manuscripts were returned within 90 days. But sometimes, delays happen, right? So I think the reviewing cycles are being, and this is true for other journals as well, Org Science, AMJ, ASQ, they're all sort of returning manuscripts much more quickly. Sometimes delays happen. And if that's the case, you should write to the editor and ask them, what's going on. And the editors would tell you, right? I mean, there may be some, reasons for the delay, but you should feel free to ask them. And I think, and if the paper is consequential for something, I think the editors are always willing to sort of speed up the review process, right? Sometimes if it helps, especially junior scholars, right? Or at least they can give you a clear timeline.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Maybe an extension of that is, and I know I can speak about this. Everything I learned about responding to reviewers, I learned from Vibha. She does it very well. And I'm wondering maybe, tough revision, a lot of folks are, faced with that. A lot of pressure, as was mentioned, a lot of uncertainty around that. Maybe any tips or, general philosophy of approaching revisions and dealing with tough reviewers?
Yeah. So I think, we always hate that reviewer 3 or the review, third review or the second review, which drives us nuts when we are working on the revisions. We all have those moments, right? But again, I think what reviewers also do is they make you understand what your paper is about, but also what your paper is not about, right? And that's important, right? Because my approach when I look at the reviewer's comment, firstly, I wouldn't look at them unless I am like relaxed and, ready to absorb the feedback. You have to be in the right mood. But I think my focus is always really trying to understand what this reviewer is saying, right? What are they trying to ask you? And does that, and how does, how can you use their comments to think about your research a lot more rigorously, about your paper a lot more rigorously, even the execution of the paper, right? And a lot of times I never agree to, everything that the reviewers say, and I push back, but I push back about explaining what my paper is about and what it's not about, right? So I don't think, the usual way to approach the reviewer feedback is to say, yes, I will do whatever you tell me to do, because that's how I will publish my paper, right? I try to, if I can, distill the comments that will actually make my paper stronger and work really hard on them and address them. And the comments which I don't think are, reasonable or addressable in the context of my paper, I explain very nicely why I can't incorporate that feedback in the paper. So I also try to give, so I think that's a general approach I use, where I try to explain what I'm doing, but I also explain very well what I'm not doing and why I'm not doing, I think.
Thank you. So Sina, you have a question.
Yes. So thank you, Vibha, for the interesting conversation. So as a junior faculty, I mean, not totally unrelated to the previous conversation about how good it is to reach out to people. So my question is about community building in the field. And one of the things that I'm fascinated by the strategy field is these amazing communities that you know, the scholars have built. So any words of advice on how I, as a junior faculty, can contribute to like these different communities or build such communities with peers? I'd be appreciative of hearing them.
I love spending time with junior scholars, and here's why. Because they're most updated in terms of, you know, their reading of the literature, in terms of, you know, they are working on cutting edge ideas. You offer a lot in that sense, right? They're the ones who are sort of exploring, you know, the new methodological techniques and tools and applying them in their research. So I absolutely, you know, so when we have, so you have a lot to contribute actually to as a junior scholar, because you are at the cutting edge of the field in some ways, right? And that's my, you know, interacting with junior scholars is my way of sort of, you know, understanding what's the exciting developments in the methodology, in the, you know, topics and context, research settings, data sources, everything, right? So you have a lot to offer in the conversations, I think. So you bring a lot to the table. I mean, that's what I would think.
Thank you, Sina, for that question. Jiang Chen, you have a question?
Yes, so thanks for letting me to ask another question. So my question is, what is the unit of analysis when we study strategy? So last semester, I read some classics books. So I noticed that those books, they use case studies. So the authors study the structure of the firm and also the history of the firm. So, but so when I read some strategic literature, it seems that people also use the activities like mergers and acquisitions as the unit of analysis. So I'm thinking which one is the proper one for us to study strategy, and what is the difference of that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think in strategy we take organization as a unit of analysis more often than not. So that's our unit of analysis, right? But what happens is when you are asking certain questions, the answers may not sort of may lie at a level above or below, right? So, and I think that's so multi-level thinking is something which is, I think, quite common in the strategy field as well, right? So because sometimes you are studying sort of decision making at the organizational level, but you may have very interesting cross-level effects in terms of looking at you know, the environmental variables or variables one level below in terms of subunits or individuals and so forth, right? So I don't think, you know, one unit is better than the other and we should study one unit, but I think it's, again, depends on your research question, but I think it's worth sort of looking one unit above and below your core unit of analysis to see if there are some interesting cross-level effects that can explain, that can help you make some predictions or explain some, effects. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe an extension of that, Vibha, is how do you come by data sets? Data is obviously on the minds of everybody, and you've had good luck with that. I know the CVC data, obviously. How do you do that nowadays?
Collect new data, you mean?
Yeah, like where do you source your data? It seems like the field is prizing proprietary data sets and things like that more and more. Do you get it through exec ed or what's your approach?
John, this is a difficult question to ask, again, because your data collection will be informed by the question, right? It's hard to sort of decide what data you want to collect, and then I think I find it easier to collect data if I know what I want to collect, which is informed again, by the question that I'm asking. Having said that, I think we have access to a lot more data now than we had, maybe 10 or 20 years ago, and more interesting data, right? So a lot of activities that, what's very fascinating to me is we have access to conversational data now. What do I mean by that, right? So just to give you a good example, all of us know about Glassdoor. This is a website where people from different companies come and talk about their company, right? And so there is a lot of textual data where people are articulating things about their company, right? And I've seen PhD students using that data source as a way to study culture of an organization. And they're using that textual data to infer some sort of associative patterns in that data, and to sort of bring out some themes which could be related to the culture of the organization, right? Something like that, I don't think was accessible to us, right? All these discussion boards that you have sometimes internal to the company, and if you get access to those are interesting sources of data. People are scraping, data from LinkedIn, from Twitter, all these social media platforms where people leave evidence of their thinking about something, right? And these are interesting sources of data. But of course, it depends on what question you're asking. So
fair enough. We have just a few more minutes. If anybody has a question, enter it into chat, and I will absolutely call on you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to shift gears here in the last few minutes, and as is typical with our Meet the Scholar series, is ask slightly more idiosyncratic questions. And I'm going to put my own spin on it, or I know Samina always asks about books and things. I wondered, many of us, you mentioned you were coming out of quarantine. Many of us are still in it, and wondering, how did you cope? What was your, I don't know, binge guilty pleasure, or how did, what is something you did to help get through the long days inside
of lockdown
with your family? Yes.
I think I absolutely, this was an absolute pleasure to spend so much time with the kids, because we were all, and with my husband, because we were all at home. But after a while, it also got too much time together. But so we found our corners in the house, where those were our, spaces where we would be when we didn't want to interact with each other. So having that space was helpful. I think going on long walks, that that was nice. Yeah. So I think you maintained your sanity with just going with long walks. I think, and you could do that in a relatively safe way. I think, what else? My younger daughter got me interested in cooking. I hadn't cooked for a while, not because I didn't like it, I simply didn't have time to do cooking. So we cooked with her. She's 11 years old. She would go to her library, find these interesting recipe books, and then come home and us to make things. So we actually, with her, made pasta right from the scratch with the dough. You know, we would make, try different things with her. Some of them not always healthy, but it's okay. So she got me into cooking, and I enjoyed that part also a little bit.
And now that, what are you looking forward to most? What's on your to-do list once this is all over?
Oh God, I think the travel. I am so looking forward to just traveling without any restrictions. I realize that we live in a very global world, and especially if you stay in a small country like Singapore, you're always traveling because you live in a very small place, so you just travel all the time. And with the COVID shock, our life became very local, and we're not used to living a very local life. It reminded me of living like our grandparents did, where they would stay in their town or in their little locale and be happy to spend years there and not have any, they weren't going around traveling, but our lives are different. So I'm really looking forward to traveling again without any restrictions. Yeah.
I thought that might be what you're going to say.
Yeah, you know that, right?
Well, I think we're sort of at the end of our time here. First of all, I want to thank you for your generosity, your time, your insights here. I think this was just a great discussion, and it's always a pleasure to speak with you. And just we really appreciate your sharing your wisdom with the STR group.
No, thank you, John, and of course again the STR division and the people associated with it for inviting me, and for all of you for taking time. I know you're in different time zones, and it's odd hours for many of you. So thank you for joining in the conversation. It was and lovely to see some familiar faces as well. Metin, I can see you on my screen.
A big thanks to Zhao for all her efforts in putting these together and the logistics behind it. So a big thank you there. A big thanks to the STR leadership, executive committee, Tim, I saw Heather was on earlier, Asim. A big thanks to all the folks, started last year, under Samita's guidance. Tim has continued this. They're working well. They're well attended, as you can see, and there'll be more. Right, Zhao? There's more ahead.
Yes, join us for more. And since you're all here, you will receive the invitation for the next time. So hope to see you there. Thank you, John. Thank you, Vibha, for a wonderful, wonderful session.
Thank you all.
See
Take
you.
care.